Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to create methods that correspond to classes within the S4 class method environment. So we can set a method, which is really just a function that is specific to a class using this kind of methodology. So here the set method function gives you the name of the generic function you want to assign as a method. The signature is the character string of that corresponding class. So for our example, that would be infant. And then the definition of the function. That's usually written within the set method call. So for example, if we wanted to show the contents of an object that is of class infant, we would assign the function show, which is similar to a print object or a print function in S3 class, to the infant S4 object. Okay, all this is going to do, notice this cat is just going to print out all the contents in each of the slots, the slot for ID, the slot for sex, and the slot for the data. So if we get this to run, let me actually show you this right now. So notice here, we've set the method. It contains the object, or it operates as the object show for the class infant. And here it's just going to print this out. And notice how this cat function is going to print out the ID and the contents of that ID, and then the contents of the sex, and then the contents of the data. And so we see what's stored in this function x. And notice to make this run, I just had to print the object x. I could have also done this. Same thing, just like in S3 class, print x would have been identical as well. So we can also extract the method. Let me go back to the notes. We can extract a method for use within an S4 class. So for example, say I want to be able to find particular parts of the data frame, particular rows in particular, then I could set this method. Let me just run that set method there. And now I've set the method for that open bracket. And then if I run this, I will get at the first object. Oh, let me go ahead and create this object anew. I messed with the object before. So let me do that one more time. And the first row is at age 0 with that weight and that height. Okay? I could also define something to replace the contents of a particular object within a slot of an S4 method. And I wouldn't worry too much about this, but notice after I've defined this, I can actually run and replace. So now in that first slot, I replace the contents with new data. Say there was a mistake in that first row. It doesn't make any sense to have 6 months in there. I was just trying to think of something different. But let's say you got the height and the weight wrong. And then you can replace that height and the weight. And in fact, if I were to print the whole object, you will see that that new height and weight are replaced what was there before. Okay, so let's continue. In S4 classes, they emphasize checking that the objects are valid, that validity holds. So the slots help because it requires that those classes of those slot objects fit what was defined. To test that these requirements are holding, you can use the validity argument in set class. This should return a true if the object is valid, and a description of the non-validity otherwise. Okay, so here we have a function that's going to check the validity of the infant object. Let's look and just see what this function does. What it's going to do is it has an if-else sequence programming structure where we're going to check and see if all of the objects within the data, all of the data within the objects is numeric. I got that opposite, and then return the character string data is not numeric if anything is not correctly deemed numeric. Then if we run then the validity argument when we set the class infant, so recall before we set the class infant and we stopped here, okay, where we just defined the class of each slot within our S4 class infant, but now we have this validity argument that will help us determine when there are inconsistent objects within our infant class. And so we can run objects down here that fit our definition of infant class objects, and that would be X. Or we can create a new one, Z, where something's wrong, and take a look and see what you think is wrong. But you can see it right there. Now, this time sex and ID are fine, but the way we've defined the age of the infant is non-numeric, so it should return data not numeric. Let's take a look at this and make sure that this works for us. Okay, so here we've got the validity argument, or function, I should say, defined. If we enter it as part of our class definition right here when we set the class infant, then I can run something valid. And notice when I run that valid object X, I'll just rerun it here. Everything is as it should be. In fact, I can even show the contents of X and everything looks great. If I then try to run Z, I get that data not numeric. And that data not numeric call or warning message or error message comes from right here. That was defined in that validity.infant function here. So we can get back informative, useful, helpful feedback if an object is ill-defined this way. This is just nice programming protocol as you use S4 classes. Notice, by the way, if I try to show the contents of Z, it wasn't well defined, so there is no Z object to be found. A little bit more about S4 classes. We can actually extend an existing class to contain, say, additional slots or more structure. The methods defined for that contained class can also be used for this new extended class, which is nice. The validity arguments also would apply to that class. So it's an easy way to get a new class that kind of builds off of an existing class. So if you like a class, say, of an object that you know is S4 that's out there in a package, you can extend it to do something more, say, than what the original authors of the class designed it to do. So for example, infant would be, let's say infant is a superclass of infant.birthOrder, or infant.birthOrder is a subclass of infant. You can say it either way. It's a little backwards. This has always seemed backwards to me. I think we should be saying that the infant.birthOrder is a superclass of infant, but that's not the way that R defines it, okay? So infant will actually have fewer slots than infant.birthOrder, but the fact that it's a superclass comes from the fact that infant was defined first, and all the work was done for infant, and birthOrder just extends that infant class to contain some more information. So all we have to do to create this infant.birthOrder is we just need to set a new class. We need to, in the representation, say that birthOrder is going to be numeric. That's going to be the new piece of information contained in the infant.birthOrder class, and that it's going to contain the infant class item. We can redefine set method to apply to infant.birthOrder, and all we have to do is again add in the extension that it shows the birth order. So here's a definition of a new object that will have the class infant.birthOrder. And notice it's just containing that birth order variable. So this would just be whether you are the first child in the family or the second or so forth. Not super important, but it's a nice attribute, again, of S4 classes and methods that seems important enough to point out. Again, just as a review, the advantages of S4 classes and methods is that the class of the data in the slot needs to match the class of that corresponding slot. So this really does some validation checking for us at some level, or it won't allow us to ill-define a slot. It can check validity, so this is really nice. It has that inheritance property that we just examined, so we can use that superclass and extend an existing class. After a class or a method is defined, we no longer need to think about that internal mode. We can just think about using the classes and methods. So it really simplifies our coding, makes it far more compact. It requires some planning. To have an overall plan about what kinds of objects you're going to need for a process that you're writing and what kind of methods you're going to need, you really need to think through that prior to starting to define your classes and methods, or else it could become a big mess. So I guess that's an advantage, or it could be a disadvantage. I could see it either way. But you do need to plan and think ahead.